program, we'll try to talk about the American foreign policy under Trump, the temptation of power especially. Now, we would like in this session to probe the pros and cons, to see the two narratives, the Trump narrative and the counter narrative. And each one, I'm going to turn this session into interactive Q&A session in order to capture the attention of the audience. And then we will open the floor for your question and comments. No president have generated so much controversy in American foreign policy and domestic agenda as this president. We would like to see how this presidency unfolded itself. We have a lot of writings describing the White House as chaotic, dysfunctional, dissonance between what the president say and what his administration is saying. There is also marginalization of foreign policy apparatus, State Department, downgrading of diplomacy, a lot of personalization of foreign policy, like a Twitter-based foreign policy almost. Instant, knee-jerk, rapid, quick responses, formulation on terms of, in fact, it is almost like Trump-centric foreign policy. What's lacking, I think, is institutional foreign policy. Where are the advisors? Where are the groups? These are the questions that the opponents of this administration are raising. On the other hand, we would like to talk about the supporter of Trump. Is this is Trump speaking on his own, representing his own, or this is a manifestation of a larger structural shift in American grassroots level, i.e., American probably have got fatigue of all of this involvement, overextension in wars and upheavals, and they want home. And is this only represented in this president, or this is predates this president? We know that Obama talked about nation building at home. We have Obama doctrine, and I know that Robert worked in the Obama administration, and he could shed some lights on this. Obama talked about burden sharing. He talked about free riders and what have you. So we would like to see this. What we want to do is to talk about the two narratives of this president. We want to talk about the place of also of the soft power in this administration. And finally, we would like to examine some of the premises of Trump foreign policy, unilateralism versus multilateralism, engagement versus disengagement, globalist versus regionalist outlook to foreign policy. We have today 4 distinguished panelists to cover these themes, and we are fortunate to have them. They come with a solid credential, very rich experience in foreign affairs, and I'd like to introduce him briefly. We have Michael Rubin, resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy and Research. Next, we have Ms. Danielle Pletka, Senior Vice President, Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute also. We have Dr. Andrew Parasiliti, Director at RAND Center for Global Risk and Security. And finally, we have Dr. Robert Malley, President and COO of International Crisis Group. We will give each panelist 3 to 4 minutes to answer the question. And then we will have another round of discussion, and then we'll open the floor for the question and answer. Now let me talk to, I'm going, if you don't mind, by your first name. So it's okay with Michael, I will start with you. I would like to talk about how to decipher U.S. foreign policy orientation and transformation under Trump. In what sense it is different than Obama, let's say? Now, his critics accuse him of undercutting American commitment to the liberal order prevailed since Second World War. He is someone who wants to unravel that order and rebuild another one. How do you see his policies? How do you put them in context? Is Trumpism, is it an aberration, a passing phenomena? Is it reversible in the future? Does his foreign policy constitute a break with the U.S. bipartisan foreign policy consensus? Thank you.
Thanks, Jassim. First of all, let me be clear that I'm going to speak as an analyst rather than an advocate for President Trump. Without doubt, President Trump is iconoclastic. He believes in challenging the conventional wisdom, and you know that can be very, very healthy because after decades of accumulated conventional wisdom, sometimes perhaps that conventional wisdom isn't so wise. At the very least, it forces those of us who consider ourselves more in the foreign policy mainstream to sit back and defend that conventional wisdom, and that can be very healthy for the debate. But when it comes to Trump and his foreign policy more broadly, look, it's chaotic. It would be foolish to say it's not chaotic. The question is whether it's chaotic by design, or whether it's because of the nature of President Trump's personality, or whether there's a logic behind it. But then there's the additional question, this impacts administrations, the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and so forth, about whether the implementation of any sort of strategy is itself, whether that implementation is chaotic and undermines any real proactive U.S. strategy. I'm afraid under President Trump, as in the past, we haven't really had a very proactive foreign policy for quite some time. We tend to be much more reactive, and that's seen. That said, is President Trump an outlier? You know, I hope he is personally, but I'm afraid increasingly the wild swings of the U.S. foreign policy pendulum are going to increase, and that perhaps he's not going to be as much of an outlier as many of those in Washington hope.
Okay, Daniel, I think we'll ask you about the counter-narrative here in this context. That's to say, does the views and the perspective of President Trump represent his views alone, or is it symptomatic of a substantial change in American body politic? American body politic that's no longer interested in involvement, in defraying expenses, paying costs for America's larger global role. Do you agree?
Thank you, Jassim, and thank you to the strategic dialogue. Really, it's enormously impressive. I'm glad to be a part of this. So you ask the key question, really, has America changed? Is Trump the leader of a country that has changed its view, or is he a man who speaks for himself, and once we are rid of this particular president, will American foreign policy go back to status quo ante? And the answer to that, I think, is complex. You know, every single president of the United States for more than the last half century has come into office and said that he did not wish to be engaged in foreign policy in the way that his predecessor did. If you remember, it was for Barack Obama, it was nation building here at home. The implication being we were doing nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that was ignoring the problems at home. But George W. Bush came to office saying the exact same thing. And then for those of us who are old enough, you'll remember that Bill Clinton came into office, and remember his tagline? It's the economy, stupid. Remember, because we were stupid because George H.W. Bush had been engaged in the Gulf War. The reality is that if you ignore foreign policy comes and finds you and grabs you. And this is just this has nothing to do with partisan politics. So when presidents of the United States suggest to their followers, Republicans or Democrats, that somehow we can disengage, the reality is that the world will not let the United States disengage. And that's, to my mind, to my mind as a national security expert, that's a good thing. So when we talk about what America first means, this phrase that President Trump really likes to use, the meaning of it is sort of, depends on the moment. For him, it means sanctions against China, but it also means deeper engagement potentially in the peace process. I'm not quite sure how to reconcile this sort of jingoism with actual foreign policy. I think there are a few things that are important to understand about what Michael rightly labeled the reactive nature of American foreign policy. Part of it is that since the end of the Cold War, we really haven't had a theme. We haven't had a defining, unifying idea about what America has to do in the world. And this afflicts every single president. We're not standing up against anything. And to the extent that some, and I would say President Trump included, have tried to substitute Islamist extremism for communism. This is the great battle we're fighting. It's not terribly persuasive because, of course, the major threats that we're facing, while Islamist extremism is one of them, are certainly coming as well from revisionist powers, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others. And so that's very important to remember. And what another challenge, I think, for many of us, for many who look at us, is to see the difference between the president's rhetoric and his administration's policy. And for observers, it's much easier from Washington to understand this. For observers from the outside, it's extremely confusing. The president suggests that that somehow we ought to be getting along with President Putin, that he really gets along with President Xi. He had dinner last night with President Erdogan. And yet, if you look at American foreign policy practically, what you see is a series of the most stringent sanctions that have been imposed against Russia. We have imposed sanctions in the wake of the arrest and detention of Pastor Brunson on Turkey that have assisted in forcing the Turkish economy to the level of collapse. And we have gone after China for a variety of reasons, some of them economic, some of them political, some of them rational, some of them irrational. But again, there's this disconnect between what the president says and what his administration does that I think is very confusing to outsiders. As a result of that, what you see is that when we are confronted with a crisis, for example, the recent murder of Jamal Khashoggi, nobody knows what it is that the United States is going to do. When countries don't know what the United States is going to do, they make calculations based on assumptions that are often false, self-serving, misdirected for whatever reason. There's another last bit, and then I will turn things over. There's another last bit, and this is something that I've been warning my friends of in the region in particular, but I think that it is a broader problem, and that is what I call the injection of politics into everything. And when I say everything, there's a trope that in the old days, politics stopped at the water's edge. That was never true, but now I would say politics infuses absolutely everything. How do we see this expressed? We really can see this expressed in the current debate over Yemen, okay? Now, we understand, those of us who look at this carefully, that the challenge, for example, that Saudi Arabia and others, the United Arab Emirates included, face is the expansion of Iran and Iranian proxies. This is what the fight in Yemen is about, okay? It's not about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, it's about Iran's attempts to dominate the region through proxies, through its own action, through the export of weapons and the support of terrorist groups. Okay? That conversation has completely been lost in Washington, D.C., and everybody is confused now about, should we punish Saudi Arabia? Should we punish Saudi Arabia because of the Khashoggi affair, or is it because of what's happening in Yemen? Now, and I would suggest to people that that confusion is enormously dangerous. Of course, the United States should stand for human rights. The United States should stand for a conflict that does not involve substantial civilian casualties, which is an enormous problem. But if we are standing against Iran, and I think that is in fact the US policy, then we need to be a little bit less confused about how we move forward. The fact that we keep stepping here and stepping there and stepping all over the place is an indication of that confusion and is part of the challenge that everybody faces with the foreign policy of the United States. That is not a Trump problem. That is an American problem.
Thank you, Danielle. Now, I'd like to ask Andrew, if you notice in the last speech that Trump delivered at the United Nations General Assembly, he attacked the very concept of multilateralism, globalism, what he called. And let me quote what he said. Americans are governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism. America will always choose independence, cooperation over global governance, control, and domination. It's very clear where the president stands in this. My question to you, could you please decode for us what is America's first slogan and make America great again? Can you reconcile this with what Obama have said and what Danielle have just mentioned, Obama's nation building at home? Is this different than the Obama version or something totally different? And is America first slogan tantamount to America alone?
Well, thank you, Jassim. Good question. And let me thank Dr. Ibtisam once again for inviting me here, and especially for how you framed this debate, not just about the changing international order, but the changing nature of power in the international order. And I think those were searching questions you put forward. Let me say this, make America great again. Let me focus on two words there. Most Americans believe America is great and that America should be first in our foreign policy. And there's a consensus on that. And I think the term of art, if we were talking about it, would be Americans believe in American exceptionalism. And that's not just about our power, and we have had, vast economic and military power. It's also about what we perceive as our purpose in world affairs. Americans believe that they have a role in the world. They believe that the model of American democracy can be a model for other countries. Sometimes that can be perceived in other capitals as intrusive. As Dr. Ibtisam said, sometimes it comes across as a one-size-fits-all characterization. But that's a sense of American exceptionalism, and I think that's across all Americans of political persuasions. Let's focus on, again, this means that when President Trump was running for office, he didn't think we were at what we might be called peak great, and that it's his policies that need to get us back to that level of greatness. And what he's done is tapped into a discontent and an uncertainty and a worry among significant segments of American society who have not seen the advantages of globalization, especially those in rural parts of our country, manufacturing areas, where jobs have been lost, people are suffering from an opioid crisis, and the excitement about technology and change and artificial intelligence and the dislocations that will come in the labor market, people are really worried about that. And it's especially prominent when he talks about trade deals. Because even though I think there's a general consensus on the advantages of the global liberal economic order, there's an aggregate gain for everybody. But there's no economic model that does not have dislocations and people who are affected by change in the United States and throughout the world. And many of those people have been affected by that change are supporters of President Trump. And when he talks about these bad deals, or that China is not trading fairly or engaging fairly, that resonates. And let's be frank, I mean, the issue of Chinese trade has been an issue for all administrations and how we've dealt with them with intellectual property rights and all sorts of issues. But he's taken it to another level, and he has support in taking that to another level. So I think when President Trump taps into that mood, it's very real. Now, I would say this, and to pick up on what my colleague said, Americans are divided. It was a close election in 2016. And Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Trump won the Electoral College. You see what's happening in the midterm elections. You know, both sides win, both sides lose. In terms of our national security process, you had asked this earlier, you know, in terms of presidential style, it may be chaotic by design. But we also have well-established and you know, very prominent secretaries of state and defense who also are deeply involved in implementing American policy that speaks to long-standing interests and the role of Congress. And now with the Democrats in charge of the House of Representatives, there will even be a more assertive posture in the role of the legislative branch in influencing policy, especially and including on Russia and Russian sanctions. There'll be investigations that will continue, which will further limit or constrain President Trump's ability to engage President Putin on any number of issues which I think would otherwise be his inclination.
Thank you, Andrew. I think it's the turn now of Robert. We will shift to the discussion of America's soft power as opposed to America's hard power. A lot of analysts question this administration employment or lack of interest in the soft power or dissipation of America's soft power. Like Daniel Byman, for example, of Brookings have claimed or argued that America has squandered its soft power under the Trump administration. He mentioned that there is more emphasis on hard power. There is an increase of 10% in the military expenditure to $700 billion. At the same time, there is a drastic cut in 28% in the budget of the State Department. There is also, he said, there is 12% of all area expertise in the State Department have left during Reagan, which means depletion of expertise, area specialists or area expertise in this administration, which affects America's outlook. Added to this, there is a drop of 7% in the enrollment of foreign students in the American colleges and universities as a result of this anti-immigration and visa restriction to America, which will do a disservice to the long-term American interests. I would like you to examine this thesis and shed some light on America's soft power in the equation. Thank you.
Thank you. And first, I want to join my voice in thanking Dr. Ibtisam and the partnership between our two organizations, which we formalized yesterday. I want to first sort of build on what my colleagues have said, and I'd say to begin with, there's a lot of similarities in what people are saying. There's a lot of, I think you'd sense, the crowd would sense some discontent or some disagreement with President Trump's policy. I think we would all share some of that, so don't view this as a cross-section of America. There's some differences, and maybe we'll get engaged later with Danielle on Yemen and how best to address Iran. But in general, I think the theme that you're hearing today, which I would build on, is that President Trump, in my view, is the exaggerated, inflated, almost caricature-like expression of trends that precede him and that will outlast him. And I think you've heard some of those trends already today, which is, first of all, I'd say a natural decline in the relative power of the United States. That's inevitable. All powers at some point are confronted by others. This is a country that has been able to act as one of two superpowers, then in a unipolar world as the only superpower. It is normal that other countries, China in particular, but others as well, will rise relative to the United States. So that was inevitable. There also is, as you yourself mentioned, fatigue, great fatigue with over-involvement, over-investment in what is perceived as over-investment in foreign ventures, particularly in this region, Afghanistan, Iraq. Let's not forget, Afghanistan is the longest war in America's history. It's a war in which people who are now called to duty weren't born when the war was first launched. That's unprecedented in the history of the United States. So there's a fatigue with overextension in those conflicts. There's a fatigue with nation building, what's perceived as nation building abroad. There's a fatigue with a sense, rightly or wrongly, that the US has carried too much of a burden, et cetera, et cetera. And if you'd go back to the campaign that President Obama waged in 2012, that Senator Sanders raised in 2016, that President Trump and other Republicans did, it's all building on this theme. The US shouldn't be sort of tried to police the entire world. It should focus on its own affairs. And I think that's, again, President Trump is to a large extent a manifestation of that. He's also a caricature of that, as I said, or at least he takes it in a different direction from where others would take it, and that comes to your point. His rejection of multilateralism, his espousal of a very transactional foreign policy, of a valueless foreign policy, is something that is, again, it has some resonance among other Americans, but it is disconnected from where I'd say the bulk of even that foreign policy establishment that is fatigued with over-militarization of American foreign policy would not espouse that. So that brings me to your question about soft power. First, a caveat. We can overstate the degree to which soft power was effective in the pre-Trump era, particularly in this region. I think many of you would sort of scoff at the notion that U.S. had an effective soft power when you think of Abu Ghraib, when you think of U.S. policy in general in Iraq, when you think of U.S. support for regimes that were anything but democratic or respectful of human rights. So let's not paint with in a rosy color how effective the U.S. had been at projecting its soft power. But it is different when you have an administration, which you have today, which is almost making a religion out of its rejection of soft power and out of rejection of values as a guide to foreign policy. And how that affects the United States, again, I'm not trying to paint a picture of the U.S. as having been a model of promotion of democratic and human rights values, by no means. But when you have an administration, it's much harder today for the administration to promote issues like open borders or respect for refugee rights or human rights or freedom of the press. When you have an administration that both domestically and in its foreign policy seems to be systematically undercutting those values. And you're hearing more and more today, countries around the world that are citing either things that President Trump has said or has done, calling the media the enemy of the people, the press the enemy of the people, in order to justify their own crackdowns, which are always far worse than anything that the US may do, but invoking those statements and those policies as a means of undercutting their own critics and resorting to a form of whataboutism and saying, well, what about what the US is doing? How can you criticize what we're doing? And I think in that sense, you're seeing a real degradation and discrediting of the US as a model of much at all. I'd end on one note, which is for those who do believe in the fact that the United States should have a value-driven foreign policy, There's a flip side, a more optimistic side to this. Those parts of the foreign policy establishment, I'd say many Democrats in particular, who were reacting to the President Bush's era and the notion of involvement abroad by basically rejecting the sense that the U.S. should meddle in should get involved in other countries, should get involved in foreign policy. I think as a reaction to the extreme version of that in President Trump, are rediscovering the virtues of promoting human rights and democracy. And you're hearing that from people who were more in a sort of a more inward-looking view of the world. I think they're now rediscovering, because President Trump has carried it so far, that a foreign policy that is completely divorced from a sense of values and of promotion of things that historically we have said we care about is a foreign policy that doesn't have a leg to stand on.
Do you think that the president is not definitely a game player? He's a game changer. Is he a game changer in town?
I mean, I would completely espouse what Mike was saying earlier. I think he is an iconoclast in the way he expresses himself and the way he does things, even though, as I said, in some ways he's derivative of other trends. And I would say, coming from an organization where we try systematically to defy conventional wisdom, to raise questions where we think that questions have been wrongly settled, that's not a bad thing. I think the real problem is that he's answered those questions almost systematically in a way that I wish he hadn't answered them. So it's not the fact of raising questions about the utility of NATO, about some of our alliances. I'm all for that. I wish he had answered them in a very different way from the one he's chosen.
Thank you, Robert. Mike?
I just think there's a bit of a danger in the conversation, because while we can agree that President Trump is a lightning rod of controversy, one of the things that differentiates the United States from so many other countries is that the United States still has a rule of law. President Trump alone cannot make foreign policy. He needs the buy-in of the Congress. He needs the buy-in of other, he needs to be able to coordinate with other members of the executive branch, be it in the State Department, in the Defense Department, and so forth. And so there are ample checks and balances, which frankly don't exist in some other countries. So while I find President Trump's rhetoric about the media to be repugnant, at the same time, the rule of law in the United States, the independence of the judiciary, sets us in a far different place than, for example, a country like Turkey.
Okay. Daniel Madeleine Albright has once said, describe America as the exceptional and the indispensable. Is America today the exceptional and the indispensable under this administration?
That's a good question and a hard one to answer. I always believe that America
Be
is...
closer to the microphone.
Which one? This one? Better? Do you hear me? So, I always have believed that America is an exceptional and an indispensable power. Exceptional because, not because of our military strength or even because of our economic strength, but because the nature of the American people is such that we have gone to war and acted also without our military consistently over the last century and more, without regard to our own benefit. This is the 100th anniversary of World War I that we're celebrating today, the end of it, and this was a war that the United States entered and helped end decisively, despite the fact that the war did not take place on our territory. And while we were certainly at risk, the reality is that America was far less at risk than the parties that were in the conflict at the moment. We sacrificed an enormous number of soldiers, as we did during World War II. You know, Americans are exceptional people, and I say that as an immigrant to the United States, which is why I'm a big believer in immigration. So I don't think those principles have changed. I think that when the call goes out, the American people will step up. What I started to talk about, and what Rob really put his finger on a little bit, is, for me, part of the growing problem about how we step out. It has troubled me increasingly over the last 2 years to find my Democrat friends who are associating themselves in the Middle East with Iran, and my Republican friends who associate themselves with Saudi Arabia and Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Let me just say that is not a good way, first of all, for us to conduct foreign policy, but second of all, for our friends in the region. That is an enormous risk going forward. The idea that somehow Republicans have a set of global allies and that Democrats have a different set of global allies, and that with a change in administration, you can expect that we will now embrace a different phenomenon, is terrible. At the same time, I want to underscore that this new embrace of values and morality in foreign policy that I hear from the left in America is one that I'm delighted to see return, but that I deeply missed while I watched 500,000 people die in Syria when a Democratic president was in power and no one seemed to care. The reality is what we need to do is fight together to stand for these principles, to reject, as Michael and Rob have both said, the notion that the press is the enemy of freedom and true information. Those are the challenges to us, much more than the notion that somehow we weren't better friends with Iran yesterday.
Thank you, Daniel. Andrew, I would like to raise the same question of the American being exceptional and indispensable at this time. And also, I would like you to elaborate a little bit about the current debate, political debate in America, about the U.S. global role, its shape and contours. What kind of discourse we have in America today about the American global role?
Americans still believe that that we as a country should play a leading or major role in world affairs. That was the result of a Gallup poll this year. The number was 72%. That is consistent with previous decades in administration. So Americans are committed to a role in world affairs, and I agree with what Danny said, that ours is a country that continues to understand its global commitments and the need to play that role. And there may be differences of style and differences of approach, but some things remain the same. Let me say that you also find in world affairs, it's fascinating. I tried to look for some consistencies. We've heard about Syria. We haven't talked about Iraq. President Obama came to office saying that we needed a responsible exit from Iraq. That was a key position. He believed that the invasion of Iraq was a major mistake. We withdrew our troops, we had ISIS, and we have the challenge, and that was shown to be that perhaps a precipitous withdrawal was not the way to go. But that instinct not to get involved is also one that President Trump has. President Trump also believes that Iraq was a mistake. President Trump, mostly until now, has been hesitant about a deeper engagement in Syria, and perhaps because he understood some of the lessons of Iraq, that even when you go in heavy against one of the worst dictators of our time in this region and throughout the world, things don't always work out the way you think they're going to work out. And a lot of people were killed after Saddam Hussein was deposed, and Iraq is still struggling. So things aren't, there's an impulse that Americans have to go out and try to do good, to help, to make things better, and there's a restraint that Americans also feel because of an awareness, some lessons learned perhaps, including in Afghanistan, which is now our longest war, that no matter how much power and commitment we may employ, sometimes things just don't go the way we want them to, and Americans understand it. Let me just mention something on the issue of trends. It's fascinating. A lot has been talked about how President Trump has come in to address a number of key trends. Look at some of the things that are happening and that any administration would have to deal with. One is the rise of China. China is a formidable power, The rise of China is a key, if not key, challenge to the international order. How is Chinese power accommodated? This is a major challenge for us, and you see in the national defense strategy that a focus on China and Russia is now a key aspect of our policy, and rightly so. Where I work at RAND, we've done a number of studies that show that even despite our vast military commitment, we need substantial changes in defense posture to meet our commitments in Asia and Europe, our traditional areas. Two, the emergence of Putin as a formidable global player. I don't know if this has been was as anticipated 5, 6, certainly not in the 2012 election. This is also significant. The rise of social media and its impact on decision-making, its an ability to bring any number of issues to the world and influences, this is also key. These are major challenges, and as I mentioned in my earlier remarks about the United States, what I would call globalization and its discontents. The rise of populist feelings and economic dislocations in the United States is not inherent just to the United States, but we see it in Europe, and we also see populist leaders elected in Brazil. You see kind of some of that in the Philippines and elsewhere. So it's truly a global phenomenon.
Thank you, Andrew. I think now I will go back to Robert and ask him this question. In view of the recent midterm election in America and the emergence of a divided, polarized Congress, so to speak, would this handicap the president in the conduct of foreign policy? Would the president be mired in a predominantly domestic issue at the expense of foreign policy? What do you read into this development?
And I wouldn't predict a major shift as a result of the elections. I mean, let's not forget, Congress, in particular the House, doesn't have a major say in foreign policy, so President Trump will have the ability to conduct his policy as he wants. So I think there are certain areas where there will be an impact. Obviously, he's going to be drawn into investigation after investigation. I think the House, now under the control of Democrats, is going to investigate everything from his taxes to his finances to his relationship with Russia, and perhaps even with some Gulf countries, what the administration knew about the Khashoggi murder, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to take a lot of time. It won't necessarily impact what he can do in foreign policy, but it might have to impact his mood and his time management. And there are other issues. I mean, obviously Congress has power of the purse, so they'll have some ability to try to affect defense spending. On an issue like Yemen, I think you're going to see Democrats in the House try, and Republicans and Democrats in Congress try to perhaps put some more restrictions on U.S. involvement. The issue of Russia, as I said, will come up. But I think as a general matter, presidents, after they are more hobbled in their domestic policy, they tend to invest more in foreign policy, so it could play both ways. I do want to emphasize a point that was made earlier by my colleague. I think there is a phenomenon now of the politicization on both sides. It's not just that on the U.S. side that you see one camp that is sort of more associated with some and the other. It's other countries that tend to identify themselves personally with one leader or another. And I'd simply say, and I say this because I'm now sitting in the UAE, but I could say it in other countries, there's no problem being close to the administration. That's what one should do if one wants to promote one's interests. But to personalize it and to politicize it, particularly in a context like as we now have in the United States, which is so polarized, it tends to create antibodies. So when countries identify with President Trump personally and very closely and reject his predecessor, President Obama, it creates antibodies in the American political system, and you'll see Democrats more inclined to oppose that country. And again, I'm saying this here. I could say that in Saudi Arabia. I could say that in Israel. I don't think it's healthy from a U.S. point of view, but I don't think it's healthy from the point of view of U.S. partners to play into that polarization because it just exacerbates. I think that's the point that was made earlier.
Thank you. Quick answers on the same question about the impact of mid-term election on the presidency capability or ability to conduct foreign policy. Quick answer on this.
Trump arguably has changed the perception of the presidency in a way that may not be positive, but there are checks and balances in the system. What actually worries me most going forward, and again, I have huge faith in the ability of Americans to have lessons learned. What I see as the biggest danger of the Trump administration is actually the gap between rhetoric and reality, especially when it comes to foreign policy, especially when it comes to the Middle East. If Trump is leading the way off the cuff with his rhetoric and there's no follow-up, too often people assume that there is a reason behind the chaos and grow disaffected because they don't see their promises or the perceptions of their promises coming true. I worry about the long-term ramifications of that as other countries look back at the Trump years and their relations with the United States.
Thank you, Mark. Daniel, would like to?
So this is an important question. What is the new Congress going to do, and what are the implications, particularly for the region? I think what we're going to see is a big push, for example, on the question of Yemen. We've already seen the disengagement of U.S. refueling for coalition operations in Yemen. None of those are a good thing, not because the war has been conducted in a way that is either responsible or, worse yet, terribly effective, but just because of the soft power questions you actually asked, Rob. We need to better understand from a United States perspective, because we are also interested in stemming not simply the expansion of Iranian influence through groups like the Houthis, but also the growth and spread of groups like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. We also have interests in Yemen. So how do we get to a solution that ends up guaranteeing our security? Let's forget about Saudi Arabia for a minute and be selfish for the United States. The challenge is, if the Congress believes that it can, quote, end the war in Yemen, much as Barack Obama believed it was important to, quote, end the war in Iraq, we saw how that came out, then we end up in a situation in which we will immediately get drawn back, in which the kind of casualties that we're seeing being taken will end up becoming worse because we are absent. We need to deal with the underlying drivers of that conflict, and what I fear is, in the partisan push to end that war that I believe will come from a Democratic House of Representatives, purely focused not on Yemen or anything to do with the threat from Yemen, but focused on the perception that this will hurt President Trump, that is going to be a very, very dangerous mistake.
Thank you, Andrew. And a quick answer to this, because we want to open the floor. Anything you have? That's okay. Thank you. Now we'll open the floor for your questions and comments, but please be very brief, as we have 15 minutes only to conclude this session. You have, you know how to use the machine. I don't. So I hope you know how. Yeah, I have it on me, but for the audience, if you have anything, please do it through the machine. I have Dr. Zafar Al-Ajmi. Please identify yourself and affiliation and to whom you are addressing the question. I don't have any. Sorry, I have Badr Shatri before, sorry. Yes, yes. No, I think we'll let Badr, because his name appeared before. I didn't see it. And then we'll give you the second one. Badr, go ahead. Okay.
The question is, the best depiction of Mr. Trump will be as a crude realist. But his realism is not a la James Baker or Kissinger. Is accumulated from a world of business, which is dog fight dog, dog eat dog, doggy doggy war. So that's where it comes from, and that's where the crudeness comes from. That's why he opposes multilateralism. He opposes that the United States plays a role. So if there is a company that is tanking, then you don't invest in it, right? That's the business view. So globalization is not beneficial for the United States, then the United States should quit globalization. But one of the most important relationships in that kind of thinking for Mr. Trump is with the GCC, where it seems, at least from Trump's perspective, that the relationship is mutually beneficial to the United States and the GCC. But now, with the measure that the United States took recently regarding the refueling, one might question even those relationships. So my question is, on both, how would you depict Trump, and also, is the relationship between the US and the GCC is framed, if not unraveling? Thank you.
Thank you. To whom the question addressed? To whom?
Anyone.
Okay.
Equal
Okay,
opportunity.
next we have Dr. Rafir, please.
Okay, my question is similar to Dr. Shatri's question. You gave him the turn, so he took my question. Anyway, it's about the GCC-US relations, and I think, and my question is to Daniela, are we going to through an ugly divorce atmosphere? I mean, we see in Trump, it's like an ugly divorce. He's asking for money from us every 2 weeks. The other thing is stopping the mid-air refueling and Yemen war. I mean, Trump is not in the mood to shape trends in the relation with us. Do you see that? Thank you.
Thank you. Auda Aburdine.
Do I have a microphone?
You can.
You know, Andrew spoke about China.
Use the mic.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
I feel the most consequential relationship for the U.S. is with China. Can the panel comment on the challenges to the U.S.-China relationship?
Okay. Okay, I think we'll take the 3 questions, quick response, and then we'll resume. Go ahead.
Okay, 2 quick points. With regard to China, I think the United States needs to be much more concerned about the decline of China than the rise of China. It's something we don't pay enough attention to. The long-term impact of the one-child policy is a demographic precipice, which is going to impact negatively China's stability. How might China react in that sort of situation? With regard to the cessation of support for refueling of Saudi Arabia, I also think it's important to recognize the origin of U.S. support for refueling operations. That was offered to Saudi Arabia specifically as an olive branch by the previous administration because Saudi Arabia was so upset with U.S. support for the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. There is a feeling among Republicans, especially in Congress, that because the United States withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that the United States didn't need to continue to extend that olive branch to Saudi Arabia, and that it was low-hanging fruit, especially given the debate which my colleagues have cited already on Yemen. Let me stop there, and I'll let my colleagues answer the other questions about Gulf Cooperation Council relations with the United States.
Okay.
I don't think, although I think President Trump is certainly uniquely positioned to advise us all about the divorce. Nonetheless, don't believe that we're in the midst of a divorce between the GCC and the United States. I guess from Washington's perspective, I might ask rather whether there's a divorce or a separation ongoing inside the GCC. Which is something that I think we probably haven't put enough thought into understanding. As to, you know, I think actually the questioners in some sense answered their own questions. President Trump is a businessman, and we've seen him take a much more transactional approach. So when he turns around and asks for money, yes, that's how he does business. We've asked for money in the past, I think that he's more blatant about it, and that does go to the conversation that we had at the outset, which is that there is a sense in the United States that our allies do not do sufficient burden sharing. Now, when we talk about that expression, it's often used within the context of NATO and burden sharing, and that conversation has arisen once again, in fact, between President Trump and our allies in Europe on this visit that he's making right now on the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. But the truth is that there is a reality of burden sharing. Now, that does not apply to the Middle East in the same way. I don't think that we expect, I hope we don't expect our friends and allies in this region to pay for our defense of our own interests. Insofar as you hear that, I think that's a very troubling trend. The notion that the first Gulf War was a great model because we went to war and you paid for it seems to me a rather dangerous one. We should be where we have interests, and we should not be where we don't have interests. So that should be the defining question, not did you pay me lately?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just make two quick points. One is in thinking about the question about the U.S. and the global order, we talked about the dislocations caused by some of the economic trends. I wonder as well sometimes if it's distance from World War I and World War II, and thinking about the armistice today, about that commitment to international security, of committing massive troops, of people dying on an incredible scale. And then in the interwar period, the insular policies, the isolation that contributed to World War II and our engagement there. As that generation dies off and people sometimes forget the cost of global commitment and security, I wonder sometimes if, therefore, some of the benefits of the liberal global order are missed. There's been no nuclear war. This was not certain in 1945 and throughout the 50s and even throughout the 60s and so forth. This is a big deal, and it's a success of our international institutions, even in the last 20, 25, 30 years since 1990. Dramatic decreases in extreme poverty, 36 to 25% of people decline from those numbers over that time. Extreme hunger, 1990, 21% of the world population today, it's down to 12%. Those are major benefits. Second, let me just say something quickly on Yemen, and maybe you weren't saying this particularly, but I would just make clear, ending the war in Yemen is not a separate issue from overlooking the Iranian role and engagement there. My own sense, not a Yemen specialist, my own sense is Iran doesn't operate in the realm of peace and negotiations. They operate well in the realm of conflict and exploitation of conflict. When the trend moves towards international diplomacy and engagement to end the war, Iran is more likely to be an outlier to that process. It's a low-cost, someone said low-hanging fruit investment for them right now to continue to send the forces they do to the Houthis to continue that war. So, yes, in terms of dealing with the Iranian role there, but diplomacy to end the war should also be a key element of that policy, too.
If I could, because that's a point I was going to make, but also more broadly on Yemen, and this could be a longer discussion which we could have separately. But I really don't think you should underestimate the degree to which this is a bipartisan feeling, not universal, but among Democrats and Republicans, that this needs to end and that our support needs to, if not end, be scaled back. And I want to explain why. And the reason I say it's bipartisan is that a lot of these people are very critical of the Obama administration, of which I was a part. And on Yemen, we did not cover ourselves in glory. I'd be the first to admit it. So this is not only against Trump, it's also against some of the policies that had been begun before him. Number one, today the UN says it's the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world. One could say, well, what about Syria? And again, I'm not going to defend everything we did in Syria by any means, but there's a difference when it's a war in which one of the parties that is conducting it is a U.S. ally to whom the U.S. is giving support. The U.S. was not giving support to the Syrian regime, was not giving support to Iran, was not arming either one of them. So that's why it creates a different kind of debate in the United States, because if it's the worst humanitarian catastrophe today in the world, and the U.S. is associated with it, there are legal issues, and there's complicity, sort of moral complicity issues. But then there's the issues that Andrew was just raising. I think there also is a question among many Americans about whether this is the right way if you want to, in fact, diminish Iranian influence. Iran's influence in Yemen has increased since 2015, not decreased. And is it the right way to go after al-Qaeda? And there's also reporting about how al-Qaeda has benefited from the fact that so much of the war effort has been prosecuted against one part, the Houthis, and that war, as opposed to the war against, or the struggle against terrorism. So I think for all those reasons, it's not simply a matter of being anti-Trump, therefore you want to end support for the coalition. There are deep questions that go beyond that, and I think people shouldn't underestimate, because I don't think it's simply a matter of scoring points against the sitting president.
Okay, we have just Dr. Bahjat Qurani, and then after that we'll conclude the session. Please.
Didn't get the answer about what Trump represents in American society. Is it a majority? Is it a minority? Given the polarization, my question is, if Trump is not there, what is the post-Trump like? Would the tendency persist, or he would be just a passing anomaly? Thank you.
Who would like to take this question?
I think Andrew did a good job, actually, in outlining the driving forces behind Trump's rise. That is that there is a dissatisfaction with political parties. This is not just a problem in the United States. My organization, AEI, has done a lot of work on this with the Center for American Progress, sort of very bipartisan, let's say multifaceted work on it. There is a feeling that political parties don't actually recognize the costs of the policies that have been pursued by consensus over the last half century plus. Those who are left behind by quote unquote globalism, those who are left behind by trade agreements, by automation. And this is really what has fueled the rise, not just in America, but in England and in Europe and in South America and in Asia, of parties that purport to speak for the people. Now, there are lots of different people, but I do think that Trump has tapped into something that will not disappear with Donald Trump. Just as I think that Cinque Stelle in Italy, or En Marche, and even the Front National or AfD in Germany, they have tapped into something that is not going to disappear, even as, in my case, I hope many of them do disappear. And so we should not describe this as Trumpism. This is certainly an element of populism, but it is rooted in something real in society.
Thank you. I don't know how much time I have. I think we have to wrap up this session, but thank you so much for your valuable, perceptive remarks and intervention in this session. I would like to thank also the audience for a thoughtful question and comment, and look forward to seeing you in the third panel discussion. Thank you very much. Okay, well, thank you again for
I would like to ask the Russia panelists, please, to take their places on the stage.
The next panel starts now. 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 The next panel starts now.
Hello, everyone. I am Steve Clemens. I'm Washington editor-at-large at The Atlantic. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Just a few minutes ago, Andrew Parasiliti in the last panel said that it was remarkable to see the emergence of Putin as such a major global contender. That was something that was unanticipated and unexpected some years ago. Last year on this very stage, when we had a panel on Russia and Russia's emergence, we had a very lively debate. Sergei Karaganov on that stage said the age of democracy was eroding, that there was too much in the kind of American-led package on democracy, and you were going to see a rollback. That was said right up here. We also had other discussions about, really from the floor, many of you who commented that it was very clear that America was in strategic contraction and that other powers in the world were emerging, and that within the region, the Middle East, but also in the Gulf itself, that Russia was becoming more of a definitive force in affairs than the United States. So we're going to pressure test some of those views here on this stage with a fantastic panel. And I want to set the context as well. I don't want to make this about Russia and the United States, but it does show at least some of the tensions in the world. We're going to open in just a moment with some someone who's going to talk about Russia's dashboard in the world, but also speak specifically about the Middle East and the Gulf. But I want to share something that's just happened in the news. Donald Trump failed to join Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron at a World War I ceremony, allegedly because of the rain. And this has created a firestorm in Twitter and the news. Even though it's the middle of the United States right now, there's explosive news that the United States has been missing in this. In contrast, a very famous journalist named Ray Suarez tweeted about Russia. He said, Russia pulled out of World War I and went home to have its own civil war. And yet Putin, even Putin, is there marking the centenary of the armistice. And I raise this because it's an interesting reflection that Vladimir Putin and Russia are in surprising places in the world, even in places where the United States, in the embodiment of President Trump today at the armistice ceremony, stepped out of that. So I wanted to share that this is very real tension, it's political tension in the United States, to see where this is. So just a little bit of context there. But let me tell you who we have to talk with us today in a chat about these issues. Just to my left, Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, member of the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, a phenomenal force in the global intelligence community, and I always value her insights, both about military affairs, but the intelligence world. Cliff Kopchin is chairman of the Eurasia Group, one of our great geostrategic thinkers in the United States, and very much an expert on Russia. And then Dr. Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council, and has spoken everywhere on Russia. I've enjoyed, during my jet lag last evening, reading many of his very, very thoughtful and informative articles. And then Dr. Oksana Gaman-Golitvina is chair of the Comparative Politics Department, if I'm getting this correct, the MGIMO University, which I understand has, it's really the Moscow Institute of International Affairs, but we can get into that. But Oksana, why don't I start with you? And we're not going to go in a straight line here, but I've asked each of you to offer some headline thoughts about Russia's strategic approach to the world, what you think are the headlines that we should most know. I'm going to ask Cliff Kopchin to come and respond to you, and then we'll kind of go back and forth for a little bit and get an exchange, and then go to all of our audience. So, Oksana, the floor is yours.
First, my gratitude to Dr. Ebtesam Atkelbi for the invitation.
I'm going to ask you to pull the mic just a little closer to you.
Loudly.
Great.
Is it okay?
That's better.
Okay. And I will express my own view, not official position. As to the interpretation of Russians' aspiration to power, they are contradictory. Sometimes people see imperial ambitions or irrational motives. In my perception, this aspiration is very rational. It includes several motives, including striving to ensure its security. Territory is destiny, Napoleon said.
Just make it a little closer. We can't.
Difficult.
No, don't keep it far. Keep it right up.
So. Terrible weapon.
I need it right up to your mouth, Oksana, if you can.
So, terrible weapon, but still. Okay, so, territory is destiny, Napoleon said, and geopolitical vulnerability of vast land space is a factor of Russian history and current Russian policy. The second imperative is striving to maximize economical benefits, including not only natural rent, I mean gas and oil that account approximately half of Russian budget. In other words, economical pragmatism is the imperative of Russian foreign politics. Foreign Minister Lavrov repeatedly said, pragmatism is a basis for elaboration of our foreign policy, referring to the fact that current policy is free of the ideological orientation of the Soviet era. As to the Middle East, Russia has played significant role here for many decades, but Syria operation does not mean only Moscow's return to the region, because it is application to a greater role. Russia strives to stop turbulence in the Middle East and consider this region as a space for seeking new approaches and new mechanisms for the conflict resolution. The military component of Russia's policy sometimes is perceived as it striving to replace other global players in the region. This does not reflect reality. Moscow understands that stabilization of the region cannot, it shouldn't be carried out alone. Military presence in the region is not the only instrument of Moscow influence here, because Moscow possesses considerable experience of solving conflicts and mediation between hostile parties to the conflict. That means that at the moment, Russia is the only state that has good working relation with rival parties to the conflicts, government and opposition in Syria and Libya, Turkey and the Kurds, the Palestinians and Israel, Iran and Israel. However, this multi-vector policy does not mean lack of principle and does not mean that Russia likes everything that regional players do. As to the Persian Gulf countries, Moscow seeks to prevent conflicts between Iran and the Arab Gulf countries, as well as between Israel and Iran. It trying to strengthen its position here without trying to squeeze out the US. Russia is energy superpower, and this fact to a great extent determines Russian policy in the region, since oil is the circulatory system of the Gulf, so we need coordination in the policy of oil production and prices. Coordination with Iran is not very successful, despite the fact that in due time Russia contributed to anti-Iran sanction lifting, and Iran is a difficult competitor for Russia. Our coordination with Saudi Arabia is more successful. Another perspective potential sphere of cooperation is development of nuclear energy in Saudi Arabia. Ensuring a new successful direction is military technical cooperation. We know that during the historical visit of Saudi king to Moscow, contracts for $10 billion were signed, and even memorandum on S-400 were signed. In addition, Saudi Arabia can use Russian assistance with relation with Iran. As for Iran, Russia is disappointed by the US exit from Iranian deal because it may push Iran to develop its nuclear program. And Russia, as well as European states, committed to this agreement. In June this year, Ayatollah Khomeini called for uranium enrichment. This statement, we know, was addressed mainly to the internal audience, but it can really happen if a new agreement on Iran is not concluded. In addition, Washington's withdrawal from the INF Treaty can facilitate Iran's missile program. And the last, but maybe the most important in this audience, Emirates, that effectively conducts an independent political course. As far as I can see, the strategy of the Emirates in the region includes two main priorities. First, opposition to political Islam in all forms, especially to the Muslim Brotherhood. Second, it is opposition to Iran's political expansion. The first priority fully corresponds to Russia's position. Both countries recognize radical Islam as the greatest threat in the region. In 2014, I remember as one of the politicians in Emirates answering the question, who are the greatest threat to Emirates, Iran, Israel, or Muslim Brotherhood, without hesitation replied, Muslim Brotherhood. It is understandable, for example, in this context, support for al-Sisi government in Egypt. For the second priority, it is obvious that Russia's mediation in relations with Iran and the Gulf countries can be in demand. And very special issue. In Yemeni conflict, Russia seeks to act as a mediator. It maintains relations with the Hadi government and informal ties with left-wing politicians of southern Yemen. On the first glance, one can see there is no space for compromise between Russia's interest and Emirates' interest in Yemen. But in my perception, the space for compromise mutually accepted. It is broad autonomy of the South Yemen in Hadi governments. So, and above said about cooperation between Russia and Saudi Arabia as potential in nuclear energy field, in tourism, military technical cooperation fully applies to the Emirates. And the last, but not least, the Emirates take a nuanced position in Syria, support the same forces in Libya as Russia. They are interested in the stability of Egypt. All this opens space for dialogue expansion between Moscow and Abu Dhabi in regional issues.
Thank you very much. Cliff, I think Oksana did a good job of creating a tapestry, if you will, of Russians' emergence in areas of the world, Libya, Egypt, and others where they had been dormant for some time, and also made the interesting comment, I find very interesting, that Russia is one of the places in the world that had good relations with many rival parties in many parts of tectonic conflict. I can think back to that comment that Danny Pletka was asking about the United States being the necessary, indispensable nation in the world, and I think to a certain degree, Oksana, you might be saying that Russia was playing an indispensable and necessary role in some of these. So Cliff, can you share with us your perspective of the Russian strategic dashboard and what is driving it? And more importantly, is it driving it earnestly and you know, in sort of a straightforward way as Oksana just did, or is it trying to cover up for weaknesses?
Well, thank you, Steve.
And I would ask you to put the mic right up to your...
Okay, well, I'm not going to swallow it, but I'll do anything else. Let me first thank Dr. Abdullah for inviting me. We met in Russia, and so here I am speaking about Russia. So first, let me say that I'm going to offer some different perspectives, but if I didn't, we'd all get bored. Let me talk about Russia and the global system first. I think that, look, the U.S. is first, I'll come back. China is, if you think in terms of hard economic and soft power, China's second. I think Russia's third. That's pretty high. And I thought about it. Germany, well, not really. No hard power, complete disarray domestically. So, you know, number three, that's not bad, first. Secondly, and I just want to say in passing quickly, everybody's talking about I don't think we're in a multipolar world. I think we're in a unipolar world. We're moving slowly towards a multipolar world. But if you look at any, in my view as a political scientist, valid indices of hard economic and soft power, we are in a unipolar world. Now, I know that's not politically correct, but I think that's reality. Turning to Russia, my dashboard's got four goals. And I think Russian goals are rational, and I think they're achieving them. And I'm speaking as a political scientist. You know, I'm not real happy about all this, but I think it's where we are. Russia's first goal, I think Russia's the leading revisionist power in the world. And to me, that's a strong statement, and I make it for what it is. I think President Putin is angry over the world's developments since the 1990s. We know the list: Kosovo, Iraq. Andre can do it, I can do it. I think being a revisionist order as number three, a revisionist power, as the number three power is a tall order. But I think Russia's been more successful than I or Russian elites or Mr. Putin expected. I think they've been very successful. I think they have played a role. The Russians have played a role in diminishing U.S. legitimacy and credibility in the world. Hacking into the U.S. 2016 elections, the disinformation campaign, documented and on press, to me persuasively, before the midterms. They're less interested in the midterms, but still, they played. And I think Russia's extraordinary skill in cyber operations has been the magic bullet that Russia has ridden to really increase power. That's number one on my dashboard. Number two, I'm going to go quickly, Steve. Control over the neighborhood. Except for Ukraine, Russia has a sphere of influence. It pretty much controls its neighborhood. Big exception, but still. Third on Russia's dashboard, feel safe within its borders. Massive progress since the bombings in the early 2000s, since the theater massacre, since the Pushkin Square bombing. I lived in Russia. It was horrible. The Russians have really made progress. Fourth, final, key goal, be a key player in the Middle East. Syria, the relationship with Saudi Arabia. I just came from Saudi Arabia yesterday. One of the things I heard that surprised me is the extent to which Saudi elites think the Russia thing is real, cooperation over oil prices. It's real. Libya, Egypt, we know the story. Let me briefly turn to alleged threats to this Russian power. You know, the common wisdom one is the economy. Yes, no structural reform. We can talk about that. I mean, it's remarkable in Russia now. You don't talk about modernization. You don't hear anything. There's no reform efforts. But at $75 Brent, there's no threat to the Russian oil economy. There's just no they're massively increasing their national wealth fund, their sovereign wealth fund right now. They're hardly falling apart. At prolonged low oil, which I don't think is going to happen, we can debate that if you want, yes, it could be weaker. Sanctions over Ukraine hurt Russia. They're going to be around for a long time. But again, at $75, $85 Brent, they're collecting money. They're not spending money. Finally, to conclude, I have 1 minute. In the Gulf, the U.S. is still Rome. That's my view. I think the U.S. is still the bulwark of the Gulf. There will be, I think, a tendency. Russia's a good hedging option against President Trump, what we just heard in the last panel. But, and here I think it's really relevant. Gulf nations, especially Saudi Arabia, in the aftermath of the Khashoggi affair, may well, tragedy, let's say, may well be tempted to turn to Russia for leverage. I think that would be a massive mistake. Russia is not able or willing to fill the U.S. role of as a bulwark of Gulf security. It would be a massive mistake if that were the way in which Saudi Arabia and other nations turned. That's it.
Thank you very much. Just before I jump to Andre to respond to share your perspective of the Russian dashboard and our, at least noticing Vladimir Putin's greater muscular and greater involvement in global affairs. Cliff, you rank Russia as the third most powerful nation in the world, and because I've read some of the things you've written, I know that you rank Russia very high on hard power, very low on economic power and soft power. But is there a dimension in the cyber world, in the sort of hybrid capacity of influencing other states that you neglect there that might raise it even higher, or that you've thought about? Where do you see cyber and hybrid and Russian muscularity on that front?
That's a great question, Steve. To get them above China, I mean, that's not a credible argument in political science terms. It may make the distinction, I think it probably does make the distinction between Russia and Germany as a global player even more profound. So it would probably bump them into a more firm number 3. And I like saying Russia's the number 3rd power in the world because it always surprises people. It's a good attention getter. I like to get attention. But I really believe it, and I think that your point on cyber makes them a solid number 3, I would say.
Great. Andre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Steve. First of all, I'd like to say
just share with us how much you agree with Cliff's perspective.
Okay, first of all, let me thank the Center for inviting me. It is nice to be back, and it's nice to see so many old friends in this room. But let me start with saying that there are 2 things on which I disagree with my friend. First of all, I don't think that Russia is a revisionist power. I think China is. Russia is a status quo power which uses revisionist methods to make its case. And it's very different from being a really revisionist power. You need to be an ascendant power to be revisionist. Second, I don't think that the Russian intention is to replace the United States in the Gulf or in the MENA region at large. I think people in the Kremlin are smart. They understand their limitations. So the goal of the Russian policy in this part of the world is not to replace the United States as the security provider in the region, but to help change the US policy which Russia believes to be counterproductive and detrimental to long-term American interests. So if you wish, the goal of the Russian policy in the region is at least partially pedagogical. Now let me turn to my presentation. I wanted to talk about Syria, but since we start a more general discussion, let me focus on more general issues of power and Russia in particular. I think that no matter how we evaluate the Russian place in the world, and the Russian role in the global international system, we would probably all agree that Russia can punch above its weight. Or if you compare the Russian foreign policy to a financial project, I would say that the Russian stocks cost more than the Russian assets. And this is something that deserves an explanation. I can partially agree with Karaganov that it is probably about the way how the Russian policy is planned and conducted. Russia does not have checks and balances. It can hardly find itself in a disarray like the United States, and it doesn't need a very protracted coordination process like the European Union. It gives Russia certain advantages. If you take Syria, for example, I would compare Syria to a very successful political startup with limited investment in blood and treasure. Russia was able to turn itself from a very marginal player in the region into arguably the power broker. It's an important accomplishment. But I think that there are certain risks that we should also keep in mind. And this is something related to Russian power and the way how Russia tries to use its power. First of all, again, if we compare Russia to an investment fund, the number of investment products that Russia can offer to the world is rather limited. Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations. Russia is a nuclear superpower together with the United States. Russia has a power projection capacity, which again Syria showed quite clearly. Russia is a major producer of a number of important commodities. That's about all. That's not enough. That's not enough for the 21st century. We need to broaden the scope of instruments that we can use to make our foreign policy investment. Second, certain foreign policy investments are quite risky. You take, for example, what Russia does in Latin America, and again, we don't know what will happen to Maduro tomorrow. And the investment made by Russia is quite significant. It's not just Venezuela, it's Cuba, it's Nicaragua. We can talk about rightist movements in Europe, in which Russia also invested. Well, these are very high-risk investments. Third, if you have a political startup, there should be someone ready to buy it when the stakes are high. And look at Syria, how sustainable the Russian position in Syria is. It's an open question. And if indeed we are going to see a gradual transition from the conflict to a post-conflict reconstruction, definitely new players will get to the fore. So how can you plan an exit strategy is definitely an issue. Now, finally, in terms of concluding, many people seem to be bewildered by the Russian emphasis on hard power. Why on earth are you investing so much in hard power while you have problems at home? Why don't you pursue a more benign policy, a policy which would emphasize domestic development over international activism? When they ask me this question, I always refer to the Game of Thrones. If you remember, in this
one more season left.
In this season, in all the seasons, they always refer. There's always one notion: the winter is coming. The assumption is something bad, something really big, is looming on the horizon, something inevitable. It's more like a doom. I think that if you talk to people in Russia today, including the top leadership, they would tell you that the world which is coming is a pretty rough place. It will be the world of conflicts, of nationalism, of protectionism. It will be the world in which it would be difficult to survive. And the name of the game is likely to be security rather than prosperity. It will be more about survival rather than about development. And if it is the case, if Putin is right, then Russia might be in a better position to face this new world. Again, he might be wrong. The liberal world order might get back. And indeed, the old rules of the game, in a slightly modified form, will be back to the table. But the jury is still in session.
Andre, thank you. Before I go to Pauline Neville-Jones, I want to ask you just to drill in a little deeper. I was fascinated by your worry, as expressed in some of your articles, about the tense times we're in, arguing and suggesting that in some senses today is much more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis because of the absence of red lines in lots of areas. And to use your financial metaphor, which I thought was quite useful, you could almost argue that the financial products you're talking about are old ones. But as you look today, you know, as our subprime crisis or credit default swaps that we had, there are lots of new arenas in which you don't have defined games, defined lines. And I think you've expressed real worry about global stability and you know, Russian-U.S. relations and others, that the chances for hot conflict are radically higher. So can you share just a few moments of thought on that front?
Well, I argued that we do not have red lines. And during the Cold War, if we are talking about mature Cold War, the Cold War of 1970s, 1980s, not the Cold War of early 1950s, indeed the rules of the game were in place. And there were communication lines, there was arms control, which is unfortunately disappearing just in front of our eyes. And that makes the situation more dangerous. But I think that there is another dimension which I'd like to draw your attention to, which explains why we don't have red lines. And I think that the explanation is pretty basic. We don't have fear, not just politicians, but societies. I'm old enough to remember 1980s and the anti-war demonstrations in Europe. Even in the Soviet Union, there was a real fear, which of course was transformed into political decisions. Right now, we live in the post-modern world, and people take war as a computer game or as a Hollywood blockbuster. And I think that this is a real problem because that's why arms control is very low on the agendas of political leaders, be it the United States, Russia, China, India, whoever.
Right. Thank you. Pauline Neville-Jones, in earlier this year, writes, Europe faces immediate and increasing aggressive activity on the part of Russia, which has spent its national capital on developing hybrid military capability and nuclear capabilities, which, in the absence of much else, it shows an alarming tendency to want to use and to exploit. Could you expand on that?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Before I just get to that, I just wanted to say that I found myself sharing a lot more of Andrei's analysis than I thought I would, because I do think actually we're moving towards something very rather dangerous and unstable. And there is, I think, growing fear in Europe. Some of the major players, I think, have an inadequate sense of the dangers of the actions that they're engaging in. But why did I say that? Well, if you live next door to Russia, as Europeans do, and one of the things I think is very depressing is the way in which the relationship, after 1989 has gone, where it held a lot of promise at the beginning, and now we've turned into a situation where there's a confrontation, which is now quite serious, and which I worry is not adequately managed. Come back to this business of actions where people are not obeying any rules of the road. the Cold War, in the end, the mature Cold War, did have rules of the road. And we did, in some ways, understand just how far you could go. And of course, we played our conflicts out, actually, on the edges of the respective empires. The great danger at the moment, it seems to me, is that there can be much more confrontation, much closer to the center. I think for Europeans, the big turning point in our relationship with Russia was over Ukraine. There were things that preceded it, but Ukraine is now really serious. Why is Ukraine serious? Because it defies all the rules that we thought we had laid down in the post-Soviet period, ending up with territory being taken without consent. So what is the result? The West doesn't want to have a fight, so it goes in for sanctions. So now we have a thoroughly sterile and limited relationship, where on the whole, the next moves always seem to be downwards. Now, I don't believe in inevitability. What's inevitable is what you fail to avoid. And I think we are now acting in ways which are failing to avoid the doom that Andre talked about. But the path we're on is not one that's going to help us avoid that doom. I think it leads to it. So I am really extremely concerned about what I do see as being the very negative use of military power, which has been at the expense of economic power, and the growth and modernization and economic relations that we ought to be able to have, and also of soft power. Russia doesn't have any soft power, if I might say so, and Russia does seem to me to be a sole actor with very few friends. So I would like to see a major change, obviously, in that relationship, but as things stand at the moment, I don't see it happening. And cyber is and the use of hybrid warfare does seem to me to be the running saw underneath the use of military power. You use techniques which are designed to soften up, to weaken your neighbors. Are they really enemies? But certainly your neighbors, and to divide them, and to increase the level of apprehension and, I think, increasingly fear. So it's a poor picture, and it's one, in my view, which is entirely unnecessary. We need not be here, and that's the way we're going. And it's really depressing development.
You're a strategist, and to some degree I know that you are a futurist, worrying about the future, and I'm going to ask a provocative question and ask our Russian colleagues. And I know you've written about the Skripal poisonings and the consequence that they have had, Andre, on European relations with Russia. But I guess the real question I want to ask is whether or not countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, even Danny Pletka said today, it's hard to discern what America is either for or against today. Whether in the wake of the Khashoggi merger, in the wake of the Skripal poisonings, when you see things on that happening in the world stage, whether or not the rise of autocratic impunity, if you will, is the way of the future, or is there something in terms, I sort of look at an eroding island that England may be on, maybe the U.S. as well, where that kind of behavior, Andre, you've asked in the case of Ukraine or in the case of Syria for all parties to basically compromise a bit and come together, which represents a certain kind of understanding that there's something good in the whole of bringing people together. And I'm wondering whether that kind of whether you feel like it's a zero-sum game between values and the absence of values in the world today, and that Russia is a key player in this.
Well, I think there is a zero-sum game going on, yes, and I do think that both sides are behaving fairly foolishly. I don't excuse the West. I think that we have made a number of quite serious errors, ranging from failure to take responsibility when we should have done, the early stages of the Syrian war, which has opened up a huge vacuum of power into which Russia has walked. Who wouldn't? Secondly, we now have a president, I regret to say this, who doesn't appear to stand for, support the values which we in the West increasingly seem to be prating about rather than believing in and supporting. And you can't preach without prosecuting and without behaving. So we're steadily undermining our position. That's extremely serious, and extremely serious for all of those who wish to be allies of the West. So, you know, you create a vacuum and you expand it. Of course, others are going to exploit it. So I think that it's not wrong to say that we are playing into the hands of autocracy, partly by occasionally exhibiting characteristics ourselves of that kind, but also by that route, giving legitimacy to other forms of behavior.
Andre, Oksana, would you like to respond to that? Yes.
Let me continue answering your question concerning whether or not some stable limits of value exist in global politics. You see, Andrew mentioned about the Game of the Thrones. I would like to continue this line of images. And I remember that all of you remember the title of famous novel by Steinbeck, The Winter of Our Concern. He used a Shakespeare phrase. So it seems to me it's my own personal concern. You see, our conference is held in the days of centenary of the World War I end. But to my mind, the current situation is much more similar to the situation on the eve of this war due to the sharpness of the contradictions. And beside the sharpness of the contradiction between global players and some regional actors, I can mention one more factor that facilitates the danger of global clashes. What I mean, in due time, in 1919, famous German philosopher Spengler shocked his contemporaries by his forecast about the Second World War. He said that the Second World War would begin in 20 years after the end of the First World War, because in this time horizon, the new generation that non-familiar with war horror would grown up. And this forecast was fully realized. After the end of the Second World War, 75 years passed, and during this time, due to the global regulation institutions, first of all the UN, we didn't deal with the global war. But during this time, almost 3 generations that are non-familiar with war horror had grown up.
Right.
And I fully agree with Andrei. And at the moment, all parties to the potential global conflicts do not share fears before the global clashes. And you see, in April this year, in mid-April this year, we were very concerned by the potential global clashes in Syria. I mean, the claim of General Gerasimov, who is Chief of Staff of Russian Minister of Defense. So, both two world war begins in Europe. I fear that the space for the next global clash would be Middle East.
Right.
I wouldn't like such scenario.
Andre, do you have a quick intervention? Yeah, Pauline?
I think the problem in Europe is not that actually people will set about
A little closer to the
warfare deliberately, but that we are now in an increasingly destabilized situation with actions on certainly harassment and military actions of a kind that I think are very provocative, leading to a situation in which a relatively minor incident, possibly, can become a major crisis. It's the lack of ability to control the situation, which I think is extremely worrying.
Can I get quick reactions from Andre and Cliff, and then I want to go to the audience. But Andre?
You know, I think that here a lot depends on perceptions. If you live in Siberia and you wake up in the morning and look out of the window and you see that it is snowing there, it means for any Siberian that it's get warmer. But probably in Abu Dhabi, you know, that would sound a little bit strange, right? So even if we assume that the future of the world will be defined by relationship between a number of liberal democracies and a number of illiberal autocracies. And it's an open question to what camp Russia belongs, by the way. But if we assume that this is the future, it doesn't mean that this future cannot imply rules of the game. I think that we can still work on rational rules. We can still work on something that would take into account our common problems. Because you take Putin, and he's also concerned about interference. He understands interference differently from what it is usually understood by interference in the United States or in the United Kingdom, but it is also a problem. It is also a problem for China. It is also a problem for other countries. So I think that the pressure of common problems, the challenge from non-state actors, should ultimately somehow unleash the natural preservation instincts that we all have. And I tend to be optimistic that we can come up with some accommodation which will not require compromise on principles.
On the scale of 1 to 10, Andre, just real quickly, so 1 to 10, how sustainable are Putin's aspirations of power?
Oh, give me the time framework.
Let's say it again.
Give me the time framework. I think that they are pretty sustainable.
10 years, 15 years,
no,
20 years.
That's too large. I think that I would bet for the next political cycle, but probably not more than that.
Interesting. Cliff.
Well, I mean, this is interesting to me because I'm much more optimistic or pessimistic.
Yeah, you're much more optimistic than Andre is.
Yeah, I think Russian power is much more real than Andre does. So you have an American who believes in Russian power more than the Russian does. So you guys, well, you know, welcome to the debates. I mean, I think that Russia is way out in front on tomorrow's problems, which is cyber. That's where I think the real risk is. You know, Russia has and can hit the U.S. financial system. Russia has been messing around in U.S. dam control rooms and U.S. nuclear power control rooms, and that's really dangerous and that's really scary. That's my first point. My second point is I'm less concerned than Andre and the Baroness about conflict. I think that Thomas Schelling, mutual assured destruction, are very, very intact right now. I think the realistic chance of U.S.-Russian hostilities, maybe briefly in Syria, that could escalate. I mean, you can paint escalation, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I think both sides are terrified. I think fear on a strategic nuclear level is very high. So I guess I'm more concerned about Russian power and less concerned about Armageddon than my colleagues.
Thank you. Pauline, quick intervention, and then we're going to go to the floor.
Two things. I actually disagree with quite strongly with both of those points. I think the situation is much more fragile, particularly between Russia and Europe in the NATO area, than you allow. And secondly, I don't think it's at all true to say that Russia is out in front on cyber. So Russia is using, undoubtedly, cyber for certain purposes, and doing so, I would say, quite effectively. I don't deny that there is no real effect in Russian activities there. But when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence and all the things that actually relate to the cyber world, I think Russia is, missing the trick. I mean, this is the future prosperity of modern and developed societies. And Russia needs to start investing in her own economic future. That is why I regard Russian power, though potent, as being quite fragile. Yeah.
30 seconds.
I love arguing as long as you really argue with each other.
Yeah, this is going to be an argument. So first, there's a difference in my mind between weaponized cyber, where Russia is, according, I think, to universal estimates of intelligence agencies around the world, a leader, and no one knows where escalation dominance would go. There's a difference between that, where Russia is possibly number one, and the fourth industrial revolution, where Russia is way, way down. So I maintain my position there. Secondly, I would ask, paint me, please, a realistic scenario of escalation leading to the nuclear level or leading to mass deaths that could happen in Europe. Realistic scenario.
We don't need to have, I think, mass deaths in order to have quite a serious conflict.
So what's the scenario?
Well, I think, you can have a really serious escalation of activity in that whole area on the edge of NATO. Absolutely.
So that I can go to the audience, I'm going to say, first of all, what a great conversation covering many angles of this. I'll tell you, many years ago, in the early 1980s, I worked at the RAND Corporation for a well-known Sovietologist named Arnold Horlich. And at that time, we had a convening of the world's greatest Sovietologists, American, European, and I would even say Russian Sovietologists. And the theme of that was essentially Russia's strategic exhaustion. So to compare that conversation today with the ambitions of power, and as we discussed last year on this stage, just a very different orientation that Russia is back, Russia's on top of many of these games, and that fragile or not, it comprises much more of our array of concerns today than it did just 10 years ago. So I think a very interesting conversation. Let me open the mic first to Mohammed Al-Salami. Are you out there? Great. Do I do something? Okay. You're waiting.
Yes,
I'm waiting
fine.
too.
Thank you, Steve.
Okay, great.
My question to Andrea and Oksana. How would you describe the relationship between Iran and Russia? Is it a kind of a strategic deep relation, or is it a type of relation that's built on the needs of both sides? Or is it a kind of overlapping interests, especially when it comes to the relation between these two countries and the United States? Thank you very much.
Andre, did you hear that?
Yes. I don't think that there is a strategic partnership between Russia and Iran right now. This relationship might gradually evolve into a strategic partnership, but it misses a couple of very important elements. For example, we don't have strong economic relations. I think that there is a degree of mistrust. I think that there are residual public sentiments which are not very favorable for the relationship, and there are disagreements on important issues, including some aspects of the future of Syria. However, having said that, I think that the mistake which is often made by our partners in the West, and specifically in the United States, is that Russia, like the United States, can look at Iran through the Israeli lens, through the Netanyahu lens, to be more exact. Iran is important for Russia in very many aspects. It is important as a partner in Afghanistan. It's important as a player, a conservative, and I would even say a responsible player in Central Asia. It is important in terms of the Caspian Sea partition. It is important in South Caucasus. So there are many issues beyond the Middle East region which puts Iran and Russia together. So I think that this is not going to be an easy relationship. Hopefully we can sort out the problems, and hopefully we can agree to disagree on certain matters where indeed the difference of interest is apparent.
Right. Oksana, did you want to give 1 minute?
Yes, I agree that Iran is not strategic partner. You see, Russia positioned itself as a mediator in the Middle East, in the Gulf region. So Iran is one of the partners. Russia is interested in preventing conflict between Iran and Arab Gulf countries, between Iran and Israel. So, and Russia is interested in coordination energy policy concerning oil prices and oil production. So it's one of the partners, but not strategic one.
Let's go next to Delawar Al-Aldin.
Thank you.
And wave at us so I can see where you are.
Well, this way, to your right, to your right.
Oh, great, great.
I'm from the Middle East Research Institute based in Kurdistan region of Iraq. And there we have seen a solid sort of comeback of the Russians, whether via oil investment, Rosneft, and other policies. My question is mostly to Andrea. Is really we're not clear yet what is the Russian policy in the entire Middle East. We are in the Middle East. We are concerned about events here. We do see piecemeal approach, engagement in Syria, engagement in Libya, engagement here and there, but we don't see a clear articulation of Russian policy in the entire Middle East for the long term. Let's think about long term. Let's say
so I'm going to cut it off there if I can.
4 or 5 years, no more.
Great. So can you give a clear articulation of what Russia's planning in the region of the Middle East? I'm going to ask Cliff to also comment on this.
Well, I think that the initial design of the Russian engagement in the Middle East was to cut a global deal with the West. And that didn't work out. So the next stage was to try to put together an inclusive coalition of regional partners to agree on a security system in the region. First and foremost in Syria, but also beyond Syria. And I think that right now we are moving to the third stage of the Russian policy, when it is clear that neither external forces nor regional forces operating on their own cannot really get us there. So we need a mixture, and this is, I think, represents a change in the Russian policy, which was manifested in Istanbul when Putin and Erdogan met Merkel and Macron. And I hope that, if not today in Paris, but maybe in Buenos Aires in a month from now, there will be discussion on Syria between Putin and President Trump. But Russia is looking for a graceful exit strategy that would allow it to maintain significant residual political influence in the region.
Thank you. Cliff?
Well, to me, the latter is key. That elite political culture in Russia, I think, craves political, geopolitical influence. It's sort of a Soviet, post-Soviet mindset. And the Middle East is perhaps the only region outside of the near abroad, the neighborhood, where that can happen. I think that's the first sort of grand organizing principle. The second emerging one is that political cooperation over the oil price, I think, has become a major Russian goal. Unexpected to the Russians, the relationship with Saudi Arabia has worked, and I think will continue.
I think, if I might just
yes,
say
please.
so, I think a major problem in the notion of any sort of rapprochement between Western and Putin on Syria and the Middle East is going to be the fate of Assad. It's a real difficulty.
Okay, next question, Abdullah Al-Junaid. And wave, please.
Here?
Oh, great. Good to see you.
Thank you. My question to Andre. From the point of view of your relation with the United States, in a way, it is a war of attrition. Your role in this is, in a way, you know, an agent on behalf of China's interest. And in the long term, it may cost you more than what you may lose now, or more than that.
You know, Kissinger once said that in this triangle between Moscow, Washington, and Beijing, the best positions belong to the angle which has better relations with the two other angles than they have among themselves. So that's the trick of the game. And I think for a very long period of time, you go to Chinese and they say, well, you know, we will handle our issues with the United States. Don't worry, it's not a problem. Right now, it is becoming a problem. I think China remains a very important strategic partner for Russia. And I don't think that it might change anytime soon, given just geography, border, you know, whatever it is. But I think that there are two things that should be kept in mind in Moscow. And these are important things. First of all, Asia is bigger than China. China is big, but Asia is bigger. And we have to keep a diversified political portfolio in Asia, which implies that we should invest more in our relations with Japan, South Korea, India is a very important factor. The Gulf is important. And our relations with China should not prevent us from working with these countries and these regions at large. And second, in my opinion, it is even more important. This cooperation with China should not be perceived as an alternative to domestic economic reforms. It's not that Chinese will come and they somehow fix the country for us. It is not likely to happen. So China is not a substitute to domestic structural changes in the Russian economy if we want to compete successfully in the 21st century.
Let me just, as we conclude this, ask you all a final question and just your brief responses. If I were to be honest, I see, if you were to compare Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump on a scale for a moment, our magazine, The Atlantic, had a piece by Jeff Goldberg called The Obama Doctrine, and that piece really told the picture of Barack Obama as one of strategic caution. And if you were to do the same on the Hillary Clinton doctrine, which we haven't done, we didn't get that opportunity, you might describe Hillary Clinton as much more engaged in a values-based expansion, a robustness of engagement in the world. If you were to put Donald Trump, I think you would put him, if you were honest about it, in my view, much more in the camp of being far, far more cautious in many ways than Trump, far more retractionary, contractionary, if you will, even in the box that some call isolationist. In that, if I'm right in that, the question then for the area we're in right now, for the Gulf and the Middle East that has invested so much in the U.S. relationship, is Russia a natural and alternative partner if the U.S. is unable to and unwilling to actually stand by the structured relationship it's had in this region? Let me go to Pauline and then just all four of us very quickly.
Oh, I don't think Russia is a natural partner, but I think Russia would become a player. Yes, absolutely. Because I don't believe that absent, but I don't, is that a serious proposition, absent the US, that the region would not find that not only would it be inclined to seek, but also it would find that others would want to intervene in the politics of the region. But natural, I don't think it is.
Cliff?
No would be the short answer. I think Russia has a secondary interest, which is influence. If this region's really looking to hedge, I think it needs to look to China, which needs its oil. Russia doesn't. China needs its markets. Russia does, but has no reason to take, or no way to take advantage of it. So I think the game is with the next panel, with China.
Great. Andre?
I think that Russia is and hopefully will continue to be a player in the region. I think it's important. I think it offers an alternative. It mobilizes other players to take a more active part, but it will be a player, not the player.
Oksana, final word.
As to the Gulf region, Russia doesn't try to substitute the US. Sometimes it has no sufficient resources for this. Sometimes Gulf countries themselves surely prefer the US as a defender of their interests. But in any case, it's one of the players in the Gulf. As to the Middle East more widely, for example, in Syria, surely Russia has its own interest. So, and I wouldn't like to concretize, to say concretely. I'm limited in time. Thanks.
With that, we will end it. I am sure we will have Russia panels into the future of many ADSD programs into the future. So at this time, I'm sure we'll be back. Thank you very much, Oksana Gaman-Golovina, Andrei Kortunov, Cliff Kupchan, and Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones. Thank you so much.